I think that this was a really important glimpse into a kind of global phenomenon, if you like, that national security doctrines are in a transition phase. There's already ample understanding that previous doctrines and frameworks have failed. Just to look at some of these issues that really reflect in these analyses, for example, the blurring between civilian and military threats and risks. What does that mean? When we look at homeland security, when we look at cyber, this whole boundaries between what is civilian, what is military, what is security, what is foreign policy, what is domestic, and what are the physics and sovereign boundaries of the system that we need to look at, within which we need to assess risk, really unravels, and to a large extent, to most decision makers, it's too much. It becomes overwhelming, and then the knee reaction is to try to simplify it as much as possible, instead of developing frameworks that could really integrate all of these new civilian dimensions into security policy development. Another element that really is driven from this is that the logic of strategy changes. And what I mean by that is that once you define your rival, your enemy, as a network or as a complex adaptive system, then the whole point of defeat becomes completely irrelevant. So you move into the realm of disruption, and how do you disrupt rival networks rather than defeat them. And in this sense, while I think that among the security establishments in many places across the world, this has already been adopted and internally institutionalized, here the key challenges, if you like, are political and cultural, because we still expect victory. And we still accept defeat and decisive action, and by decisive, it's solution. So this, again, needs to completely transform and educate through complexity, I think, the discourse between the political and the security echelons, and of course between politicians and citizens at large. And the last thing that relates to this is the logic of implementation itself. Because here again, traditionally, everyone is looking for a silver bullet. The idea is to concentrate efforts in order to solve a certain problem. But of course, when we move into disruption rather than solution, then we move from concentrated efforts into distributed efforts. And we move into creating accumulated interventions on a much wider scale of the network, with a lot of experimentations as well. And failures along the way as well. And here the key challenge is, how do you create the policy design frameworks for this? And again, within the US Army, within the IDF, and here as well, I think certain frameworks like that have already been developed. But then another key challenge is, how do you create synergy between all the different elements and the agents that really will be involved in implementation? Because when we look at creating resilience, and when we look at all the challenges of implementing the actual policies that will be designed, what you actually have is a much wider network of agents working constantly to build up that resilience. And how do you create synergy? And here I would like to stress the differentiation between synergy and actual coordination, because they need to share a conceptual logic of the kind of network they're dealing with. And just lastly, on the very, very important of leadership and learning through action. Because when we look at decisive moments, actually, when you work through complexity in military operational design, you're looking for the decisive moments, because this is where you actually get your information from. So you intervene, something happens, that allows you to learn about what is actually happening within your network and adapt. And again, there's a huge conceptual, cultural chasm between that and the old doctrines.
Thank you very much, Orit. If I may, I would just like to start with a couple of points that link the two together. I was absolutely delighted when you said that resilience is not going back to the status quo. It is so often the assumption. And I agree with you entirely that it is a matter of evolution and learning. Learning is very much adapting to a new environment. But it's also this idea of experimenting. So you bring in the idea of evolution, and then what Orit said was that it's synergy between different agents. It is the co-evolutionary dynamic. So I think we need both. We need to understand that it is both an evolving process and a co-evolving process. And if we understand that, I think we change our perspective altogether. Did you want to make any comments on Orit? Excellent. In that case, I'll open it to the floor. And any questions, comments? Yes, sir. If you just wait a moment. Please tell us, state your name and affiliation.
Kalalen, I'm retired, so I'm just a member of the public. To Jamie, so basically what you're saying is that your assets, there can be a very long distance between your assets and your strength in responding to a situation.
Well, they run on all sorts of different temporal horizons. Sometimes it's very, very short, and sometimes they're quite protracted. But it's meshing them that's really tricky. So, I mean, one way in procurement I can address this would be we procure things, some platforms, which, like an aircraft carrier, however wise or not that decision is, and we will spend an awful lot of time trying to figure out how we design the hull. And there's actually only about 3 hulls you can consider. What you put on to that thing is constantly evolving. The software upgrades, how it fits with allied navies, is constantly morphing in ways that are very hard to anticipate.
Okay, there was another hand up a moment ago. Yes, sir, and then Steve, and then Claudius.
Sorry.
Please say who you are.
David Hales, Open University. It seems to me like a lot of the sort of innovative, non-bureaucratic, disruptive and adaptive entities that have arisen recently, certainly in the technological space, are things like, open source projects, Wikipedia, Anonymous, WikiLeaks. They don't do bureaucracy, and it seems to me what you were saying is the real enemy here was bureaucracy. So the question really to me is how, I wasn't quite sure how you're saying like we have to get these non-value adding policy people out, but what's the strategy for attacking the bureaucracy in that sense? And what about 4th generation warfare concepts of drawing on ideas from P2P and from the kinds of novel organising processes that have happened on the internet, and maybe bringing those into them?
First off, the issue with bureaucracy is not a new one. I can point you to several studies out of the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, and sparing you a long read. It basically said, we've seen the enemy is us, and in particular our bureaucracy. And that was their assessment of Vietnam. So in some ways it hasn't changed, but essentially what I was saying was, who is actually adding value? The word I keep hearing in what we've discussed today and elsewhere is citizens talking about policymakers, but who are these guys? And what is it they're doing? I think one of the most seditious things that was ever done in Whitehall was giving arts graduates email. In the Defence Intelligence Service, at the back of the Defence Intelligence Service, there is a little courier's box from the late 19th century, which was, after the Northcote Trevelyan reforms. This box, which is literally about that by that, trundled around Whitehall twice a day, and we ran an empire. We now have terabytes, gigabytes, petabytes of emails running up and down this street, achieving what? And that's the fundamental issue we've got to address. You are the citizens, you're paying these people, what value are they actually adding? Well, I think you have to start demanding what it is. What you'll find in policy circles is they'll all blame it on the technical weeds. They know how to operate a quill, they don't really know how to administer an IT system. They can't drive innovation. So the fundamentals you go for are very straightforward. What are the selection criteria for fast stream? And if you're selecting for bright people who can draft, is it little wonder, and drive committees, is it little wonder we have no entrepreneurs? If you're paying them to never take a risk, is it any wonder we don't get any innovation? So there are some quite simple things that need to be done, given the material base as it is.
Julian, is that directly relevant to this point?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
This is a question of the structure of government and how it works. I was the head of the Met Office, an academic from Cambridge, and this was the high period of Thatcherism, when she believed in hiving off government. So there was another academic ran the Ordnance Survey. So in 2 years, we completely changed the pay and grading in a government, both these government departments. And of course, we were criticised by Whitehall for going too fast. But the point being that it was what has been extraordinary about the UK is we've switched from this idea of agencies. The present government has come in with the idea that this is very unresponsive to the people's representatives in Parliament. So we're going back to a very large internal bureaucracy. Now, I mean, this is a political speech, of course, but it's really an objective speech because really the point is that the study of this issue of responsiveness of bureaucracies to Parliament versus hived off executive action, which was the model for 20 years, and we've now lost that model. So it does seem to me that's an area. I mean, you implied there was a long drift of everything getting worse. I mean, the point is it's a highly deliberate decision that the present government has gone into, and I just think that needs to be studied. And the question is, I think complex systems, as it were, or analysis of these different systems. There was no analysis of the systems by the incoming coalition government of this total transformation of our government. It was an intuitive idea, and my point is we now need to study that. Has that worked or not?
Thank you very much.
Sorry, could I respond to that?
Yes, please.
Sorry, adding to those points that Julian's made. I remember vividly in the preparations for a likely Conservative government, never mind a coalition, when the idea was mooted. So there was all this talk of a post-bureaucratic age. At exactly the same time, they said no more Safer government, and we're cutting the number of SPADs. 18-month special political advisors. Now, these are the only people with skin in the game who've actually got interests aligned with those of their political masters. Now, some of us who'd worked for the Labour administration just fell about laughing. Well, you'll get nothing done. 18 months later, they are ruining the day. They said they wouldn't have SPADs. There is a real problem in which where we need to contrast, particularly with the United States, but you could pick umpteen other jurisdictions, about how do you incentivize senior officials to actually do the kind of things that are needed there. There are two other areas that are really important in this, though. First is in the United Kingdom, the doctrine of lead government department. So whatever the crisis is, the decisive moment, they try to pigeonhole it against a particular department. The trouble with complex networks is it sits across several departments and it keeps shifting. Now, that might sound very abstract until somebody like myself, 5 years in COBRA, the Cabinet Office briefing room. The kerfuffle, the posturing, the egos, trying to get their hands around these particular issues is just unacceptable. So the lead government department doctrine has to be tackled, but it's not limited to that. Look at the parliamentary scrutiny. Parliamentary scrutiny is set up around committees that are all looking at expenditure of money over particular spending departments. That's why you're getting the Public Administration Select Committee and the Public Accounts Committee actually being the only effective committees, because they look across the issues. But each, so if you've got an issue like development or global conflict prevention, where's that going to? Is that a home affairs issue? Is it a foreign affairs issue? Is it a defence issue? And cyber is the worst one of the lot.
Okay, thank you. Before I take Stephen's question, I wanted to ask Orit if she had any response to any of the discussion up till now.
Well, I think that just in terms of bureaucracies and complexity, at least from my experience on the Israeli side, you do get very important support from the actual practitioners who need to make the decisions. But then once you make tractions, there's a huge backlash.
Exactly.
And this is something you really need to be aware of and prepare ahead of time.
Great, okay. Stephen.
In terms of some detail about the complex models, obviously in these things here, there's quite a lot of things that you could throw in. The kitchen sink had been mentioned earlier on.
Yeah.
Could you highlight how you went about choosing the elements that went in to your models?
Yeah, the synthetic environment approach using SMUTs. I was very taken with what Bridget was saying about how you actually... I wouldn't have gone as far as answers. That was maybe a little bit too far for me. But that focus on what supports a decision was absolutely crucial. And what we were very clear about was we had a large repertoire of models. Most of them, you know, if I gave a rough percentage, say 60 to 70% of them were Lancastrian-based, which was a horror. We didn't have enough of the Richardson-based stuff, and we certainly didn't have enough of the complexity-based stuff. So one of the other infights we had with the vested interests was the operational research community. They were completely wedded to particular deterministic models and wouldn't shift. That was a huge bun fight. But we also needed to be able to bring in all sorts of other disciplines. Now the trouble is, I'm personally responsible for recruiting the first anthropologist into the Ministry of Defence.
Well done.
I'm not so sure. Because what you ended up with was more of a data blizzard. And it took an awful lot of mentoring to get this guy to understand, tell me what's decisive. Research what's decisive, not the really colourful and interesting bits that dazzle you.
And he sent you an email.
And then he'd send me an email, big long email. You know? So, but actually being able to focus in on anticipating where the crises are, what the decisive moments are, understanding what factors actually affect that decision at that point in both linear and non-linear terms, and most importantly then moving on to what are you actually going to do about it? What capabilities have we got in terms of competencies and kit, and how are you going to learn? How are we going to evolve this very quickly? That was essentially what we did with SMUTs.
Thank you very much. A question from Claudius and then at the back,
I just
yes.
want to take the moment here about SMUTs. It was on the 23rd of September 1931 that he addressed the World Conference for the British Association of Science. And he was inaugurated as the president.
Yes.
And gave a speech called The Scientific World Picture of Today, in which he described very clearly the move to process thinking,
Yes.
which he called holism. So what is interesting is that after his speech, Einstein said two thoughts would dominate the 21st century, holism and relativity.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
Absolutely.
What is interesting about SMUTs is that during the Anglo-Boer War, when it looked as though the Boers were on the face of unconditional surrender, SMUTs invaded the Cape Colony. So by disruption,
Yes.
he actually created a whole new range of opportunities that actually led to the peace treaty over Vienna.
Yes.
And so it seems to support what you're saying there.
And again, the other thing I'd emphasise is there are not many statues in that square. So for a Boer to be on that plinth, very few people seem to ask the question, how on earth did he get there? And it was because Winston Churchill knew he was the guy who could advise him on how to win the war. And it was through holism.
Orit, do you have any comments?
No, just one thing in terms of capacities. I think that one way to walk around this explosion of data and how you actually analyze it is to really treat every security challenge as a singularity with the actual person in charge with making the decision making, also in charge of designing the system that draws in those different data and actually synthesizes them themselves. But again, the bureaucratic challenge is when you have different turfs actually being responsible for the different data management is extremely difficult. But once you get that done, then you have a much more modular and pragmatic model of actually working in an adaptive fashion.
One of the things I'd like to emphasise is it's very easy for this to drift into a issue of war fighting or intelligence and things that are spooky. It really isn't. It's about you guys. It's about society. It might be stuff we don't want to talk about too publicly too often. But just to give you two examples of that, my last operational campaign as a soldier was in the Balkans. And when I came back, I had the operational research analysts crawling all over me for measures. What could they quantify? And, probably hobnobs up the main supply route was the thing that they were eventually going to measure, because that was about how effective we were at the time. And eventually, out of utter frustration, I said to them, it's school days lost. That's what's going to define, and it's not a linear relationship. You lose weeks, it means this. You lose months, it means this. If you lose a year, that's you've lost a generation of the middle class, and you're going to have a gang of numpties who do know nothing but corruption, and it will take 3 generations to get their dynasty through your social system. So act now and use education as the indicator. Recently I was speaking with the head of national security in Israel, and he said, when you say there's capacity to innovate, is there anywhere you have in mind that's good at this? And I had to say to him, Israel was, until you let your education base crumble. It is a national security issue for Israel now, how they have allowed the education base to crumble. Some of the great entrepreneurs there have developed what we call in the military a jack attitude. They've got to the top, they've made their money, and now they don't really care about the education base being as good as it once was across the whole of Israel and what that did for them. It was fundamental to their national resilience.
Thank you.
Just to add one point of that, I think that also draws on the whole issue of what is national security, and to a large extent it is usually really constrained to the old-fashioned military issues, and it is extremely important to really incorporate all the civilian aspects, and that's just going to grow because the real risk is going to go to the civilian domains rather than to the traditional military domains. And here again, it is about creating the political entrepreneurship that will be able to transform those bureaucratic institutions that already exist.
Right. Now I have two at the back. Yes, the gentleman at the back there. Can you remind you please to state your name and affiliation?
Ben Lewis, Neff. Jamie, just interested, you mentioned earlier when you were talking that when you use a complex systems approach, it tends to put people's noses out of joints, particularly people in power. I thought that was an interesting observation. I'd like to hear more about that. But then you also mentioned Cobra and the problem in your experience of being kind of witnessing Cobra, of egos and people, that kind of clash of egos and people's identities and stuff. And I'm just interested, is there a suggestion that what we need to do is get away or somehow stop egos and personalities coming into decision making because it leads to these pathological or not perfect outcomes? I'm just interested to get more insight into that.
Sorry, what was the first part of the question again?
You made reference...
Oh, the power bit.
You said that sometimes when you start using these complex systems approaches, it tends to put people's noses out of joint, actually because you're treading on toes, power configurations, etc., which I think is a very interesting point you're making. And I want to hear how you answer that in relation to what you saw in Cobra.
Right. Okay, so the first point, again, I take you back to Machiavelli. You come up with a bold new idea. The vested interests are not stupid. They see what you're doing and they understand it's about to get their nose out of the trough.
Yes.
So they are going to do everything to stop. Now, whether that's the Guild of Operational Research or the Guild of Drafters, it doesn't really matter. They're smart enough to know you're invading their turf. And that's why I mentioned incentives. In my experience, the military tend to get it because they've got skin in the game. People get killed if they screw up. Politicians tend to get it. You might not think a great deal of them after expenses, etc., but the fact of the matter is they understand they're going to lose votes. The only thing an official gets is whether or not he's going to get his pension. That's all that interferes with them between then and now. So it's how you actually get at those incentive structures that's really important. Now, the issue I raised about Cobra was very straightforward. The concept of resilience on a broader front than just cyber was brought in as a result of the fuel protests in September 2000. And this was the first time Number 10 really hit networks as most of us in this room understand them. This was a scale-free phenomena that really bit them. So just-in-time supply chain with massive knock-on effects. I can now tell you, because I quickly referenced Keele University's assessment, or the classified one I did, we were 36 hours from the abyss. The lights were going to go off, food supply was going to stop, there would have been no media. That's how severe this was. I was then brought in to develop the concepts and doctrine that would enable them to address network issues. I had no idea. My essential point was we had built capabilities that we were using elsewhere with small groups. That's all I'll say. In Cobra, we had to deal with the politicians. They were right to be there. They were elected. They had a role to play. Director of Special Forces, he had a role to play. But most of the other civilian officials who quite literally sat within spitting distance of the original cockpit, and it is literally within spitting distance of the Tudor cockpit, none of them had a qualification. None of them had been trained or selected. Now my question is very straightforward. Would you put one of these people into the cockpit of a Eurofighter and ask them to go on a bombing raid? Answer, no. So why the hell are you putting them in Cobra when they're going to pull levers on networks and they haven't got a clue what they're doing? So we need to train, educate and select for people who've got competencies to take decisions in dynamic networks. That's what I was asked to do. My problem was, if I was allowed to throw all the officials out and bring in my postdoc mathematicians, the really great mathematicians I had, and multidisciplinary people to man up Cobra, we were good to go. But we couldn't do that. So we were facing 3 generations of education to be remotely near a position where you could plug and play complexity in national crisis management where it's needed. That was my essential point. So it's the usability question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, there was another person at the back.
My name's Alex Murdoch. I'm a professor of third sector management and also been involved with social enterprise for a number of years. What I'm interested in is the whole concept of civil society here, where effectively you're looking at not governmental bodies and not private bodies, but in fact societal bodies, and the Salvation Army is part of Homeland Security. It's actually the only third sector organisation that's involved in that remit, as I'm aware of. To what extent do you feel that aspects of this are applicable to civil society in responding to crisis and challenge?
The first criteria I gave for resilience was coherent, decisive action, so that distributed capacity to take decisions. Let me go back for a second to Gramsci. So Gramsci, a Euro-Marxist who basically didn't want to live with communism in one country, he was basically out to create insurgent forces within Western liberal democracies. His assessment of the resilience of liberal democracies was not about the state. The state was not resilient. It was civil society. He used the term resilience explicitly in that. So there is an adversary who'd done a proper assessment of our societies and knew what he needed to infiltrate and suborn. So it was civil society as you described. Our whole approach to resilience to crises is not just to have it in Cobra, it's to distribute it. And that's why, as I pointed out on that slide there, we got the Civil Contingencies Act, which I'm afraid is one of the most draconian pieces of enabling legislation ever passed through our Parliament, and it will probably achieve nothing. But we never did the doctrine, by which I mean the curriculum that would enable citizens to act in a coherent fashion, and how it would probably be a plurality of doctrines. But that has never properly been addressed, which again comes back to the point about usability. Who is developing the curricula for good citizens to operate in these networks?
Thank you. I'm glad that we keep coming back to this point about distributed intelligence, distributed power, etc., etc. It is absolutely fundamental. And until we actually understand what that means in practice, I don't think we're going to move into a more complexity-based thinking. Did you have any comments, Orit?
No, again, it goes back to the idea of how do you actually manage diffused efforts and how do you create synergy between all of these agents, because the overall trend will be that more responsibility will devolve to citizens rather than the government.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any other comments, questions? Yes.
A need of clarification. I agree with you with the importance of distributed intelligence and distributed capacity, but then we also need to have a learning system. I mean, if you have to act globally to contrast a crisis, you need to know what to do. So you need to have a kind of common behavior in order to. So how do you think we should do that.
In the detailed work on resilience, what we're always very careful to differentiate is the immediate action drills, which we're seriously saying, we don't want you to think. We want those drills to be in the muscle memory. You just do it. But the important point about that is not to create automata, not as a license for militarism. Those immediate action drills are there to buy you time to learn. So you buy the time to learn and then you invest and innovate. So that's the crucial point. But I'd also, as any of you are cognitive scientists in the room, the minute you drill somebody, trying to unlearn a drill is a real pig. So select your drills very carefully, particularly in a network dynamic environment where it's going to change quite a lot.
Greg.
Greg Fisher. Just to take up on this point about distributed systems, and sort of, we talked about devolved power and peer-to-peer as well, and all that sort of thing. But do you not also need integration into a complex system? So you need command and control in military environments, for example. And so does that not create a tension between sort of resilience and the need to sort of integrate the system and have command and control? Is there not a tension between those?
No. You know, Martin van Crevel covered this very, very ably years ago, 30-odd years ago. You need to be very clear. Control is all the stuff that we can leave to the deterministic folk. It works. We're not interested in that. The command issues are different, and how you distribute command. Command is a much, command has got a bad name because too many civilians think command is about control. It isn't. Command is about influence. So you can be, as Martin van Crevel explained to the military, you can do command by direction, do it because I told you to do it. But what tends to happen in organisations where you command by direction is ultimately people get upset and they'll get back at you. So, if you look at Mary Parker Follett's work on management, you can either go for wishy-washy consensus, lowest common denominator, nothing ever happens, or you can go for command by direction, and eventually they'll knife you. So the integrative approach, as you put it, but I'd say you need to address composability as well, is the approach to do it, and it can be done as command.
Julian, yes.
I'd like to have a mathematical note. You made this extraordinary remark, essentially, that reality is non-ergodic. I mean, that is completely at variance with everybody's experience of life. That generally speaking, behaviour of humanity and groups is not dependent on what they did the day before that. That's what it means. It's an ergodic system. A good example of a non-ergodic system, surprisingly, is the sale of ice creams. Yes. I understand that ice creams do not depend on the temperature that day, but they depended on whether there was a good bank holiday weather in May, and then people keep eating ice creams all the summer, you see. Yeah. So that's exactly an example of a non-ergodic system. Yeah. But may I ask you, why did you say that? Because it seems quite at variance with you could say the historical, the closed form non-linear systems, which do form patterns which are quite insensitive to initial conditions.
You're absolutely right to bring me up on it. There are systems in which you can get away with the assumptions of ergodicity. There are other systems in which things are path dependent, but nevertheless cyclical. And there are other systems, again, which are non-stationary. What I'm essentially saying is in keeping with the second law of thermodynamics, overall, the arrow of time only goes in one direction. So they are non-stationary, and path dependency in temporal systems does manifest itself an awful lot more than people would like to assume. We all like to be able to retrospectively say the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, this dot links to this dot, links to this dot. They are path dependent. That is not what our experience of altering our sensors, altering our data, altering our assessment constantly tells us about the past. Even when you think you're dealing with an authentic past, there's always new data sets, there's always new sensory modalities, there's always new interpretations of the patterns of events. So I think the focus, what I was suggesting, Julian, was rather than assuming that there's this neat path dependency all the way through event, it isn't. It's more complex.
One last question, and then I will ask the two of you to give us a sort of 30-second final reflection. But very, very briefly, please, because we're running out of time.
Sure, thanks. Ben Ramalingam, and I want to ask about our expectations of leadership. Very quickly, David Petraeus, the surge in Iraq. The documented account is that it was something, he went in there and it was a top-down reorganisation. Actually, it was a bottom-up process that was already happening. But the story that gets told is the top-down one. So there's something about our prejudice for certain kinds of leadership that even when the network is the route to success, we can't really talk about it. And that's one of the real challenges, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, my first comment would be, don't confuse leaders with leadership. My experience as an infantry soldier is that leadership will manifest itself wherever it has to within a platoon at a particular point in time. And just because you've got a funny badge or you speak loud does not necessarily mean that's where the leadership is. And I mean quite literally, the person I found crying in a heap was not necessarily the one I am with the best education, was not necessarily the person who was demonstrating leadership at a particular point in time. So leadership is an ethos. It is not embodied in a particular individual. We've heard this term bottom-up and top-down used repeatedly. I just add one simple one, middle-out. Petraeus picked up on stuff that was coming bottom-up, but he knew how to systematize it. He systematized it into something that was a campaign model or a tactical model. More importantly, it advanced him several steps towards the White House, and that's what it was for.
Actually started to integrate economic thinking and political thinking, cultural thinking into military operational design. So there was a kind of 2 years of conceptual evolution that led to that development of a new strategy that really confined the space of the command and allowed all of this much more dynamic trends on the ground to really emerge. And in that sense, just one last comment, that also relates to the fact that not everyone in the system needs to understand complexity, which is extremely important. At the end of the day, you will have drills and they will be really, really simple at the tactical level. But what you do need is a different set of conceptual tools to help the operational and the strategic levels.
Great, thank you.
Just picking up on Orit's point there about drills, she's absolutely right, the drills need to be there. My experience of training senior military officers, though, is be careful what you're doing. If you habituate somebody to drills for 20 years and then ask them to make the transformation into being an operational or strategic commander, it can't be done. You cannot teach old dogs new tricks. So, as far as possible, drip the concepts in there and broaden the pool as much as you can for those who can really deal with complexity. Final thing I'd want to say, though, is resilience is not just about bad days. Resilience is mainstream and for good days.
At that point, thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me to thank both Jamie and Orit.